Hi, Steve Stedman here with another wind, weather, and tide update. We've got some moderately high tides over the next few days and some wind in the forecast. I just thought I'd do a quick video talking about some of the things I look at when it comes to what's happening over the next few days. So first thing, we've got a forecast for Whatcom County king tide operations out of the NOAA National Weather Service in Seattle. It's showing that there's going to be a strong system to sweep across the waters this evening and tomorrow into Tuesday, and the small craft advisory will stay in place, all that. In addition, there'll be strong west winds on Tuesday, and a threat of minor coastal flooding will exist at high tide. So let's take a look at a few things on how this relates. So as we scroll down here, we can see that Cherry Point, that is the closest tide station that they report on here for tomorrow, is expecting a 10.4 foot tide at 6:42 a.m. and that the forecast would be tomorrow morning between 0500 and 0900 would be 25 to 30 mile an hour winds, and with gusts 30 to 35 miles an hour, and waves expected to be 4 to 5 feet. And when we look for Wednesday, it's going to be similar, maybe not quite as high. Similar wind in the forecast. Okay, that's some good overall information. Now let's take a look at some of the details behind this. So looking at our forecast, we can see here Sandy Point weather station, currently about 3:15 on Monday afternoon. We're reporting winds that are in the 20 to 22, 23 mile an hour range. Nothing too exciting. See that the barometric pressure has been dropping a little bit. Let's go down and look at the chart. So when we look at barometric pressure here, this is this black line, and it was up yesterday around 29.8, 29.84, whatnot, and it started midday today dropping down, and we're currently down to around 29.66 inches. That's the measure of pressure. And before you get too excited about how fast it's dropping, well, the question is how low is it going to go? When we look at our barometric pressure, let me flip over this other chart. This is the barometric pressure since October 2020, as recorded at Sandy Point. We can see that across the middle, there's a line across here that shows where about 29 is, and anywhere that it's dropped below 29, there's been significant events associated with those days. So the question is, and what those events are: on December 27th of 2022, we saw significant flooding at Sandy Point. On January 7th of 2022, additionally, significant flooding from the West Beach. Those were two very different events in that the water came from different sources in those. Minimal flooding, logs were cleared at the canal entrance, and they were removed by the Army Corps of Engineers. That was on near the end of October in 2021. No, I mean, a little bit of water on the roads that day, but no significant impacts that I knew of related to that event. But either way, the three lowest pressures that we're showing over the last 3 or 2.5 years are related with flooding. So when we go back and we look at the pressure, right now we're up around 29.65, which is pretty normal for this time of the year. But the question is, how far is this black line going to drop? And I've got a barometer sitting on my wall that I'm watching also versus the electronic one. And if we see that one drop below 29, that's where I'm going to start to get worried. But it doesn't necessarily indicate that it's going to go below that yet. But keeping my eyes out watching for that. The other thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the tide predictions that we have. So here's the tide predictions showing today. Today's was about 9.74. And this is the adjusted forecast for Sandy Point and Lummi Bay. Tomorrow the forecast is about 9.77 for around 6:30 in the morning. And that would be our local time. That alone is not that interesting because that's just the forecast, and the forecast changes dramatically based off of atmospheric conditions, weather, wind, pressure, things like that. And that's why I say when we look at the water levels here, this is an actual chart measured off of Cherry Point showing the difference over the last 2 days between, and again, NOAA calls it preliminary, but what their measurements are showing that there is about 1/2 foot to 3/4 of a foot lower on the actual tides versus the predicted tides. And we can see, like on the high this morning, it's predicted at 10.1, it came in at 9.5. So it was about 0.6 of a foot lower than what was predicted. But as we see here, as we get closer to the point in time right now, we're about 1 to 2/10 of a foot difference. So a couple inches difference between the predicted and the forecast. Now, that might just creep up right there and then throughout the night drop down to be below the forecast, or it might be above the forecast. If we take a look at what happened on December 27th of last year with our big flooding, the blue line here is the forecast, or the prediction, and the green line is the actual measured. So if we look at this, we can see that the high there was forecast to be about 10.6, 10.7, and it really came in close to 12.5, 12.6 feet. So about 2 foot higher than what was predicted. So as I keep an eye on things as we go into this, I'm going to go back to this previous measurement here, and as long as the red line is below or not too above the blue line here, that's telling me that we're pretty on with the forecast. And as we go into tomorrow, I will keep on monitoring that, and if we see the red line cross above the blue line significantly, that's where I might get a little bit concerned that we're going to have some high water there. The other thing I want to take a look at here when I'm looking at wind, and here's a video. I have an app on my cell phone. I don't think there's a desktop app, but it's called Windy, and I use this all the time. I use it for predicting wind when we're boating, and I also use it for monitoring wind around here. So I'm going to open the app and then zoom in on Sandy Point, and then in the app you can kind of click on the area and move that little dot pointer to nearby where you want the wind forecast for. So I move it right there to the harbor entrance at Sandy Point, and it's showing that currently it's about 16-mile-an-hour wind out of the south. And it's going to continue to increase a little bit on that out of the south through the night. And then after midnight, it's going to shift and start coming out of the southwest. And you notice the wind's coming out of the southwest, still 12 to 16 miles an hour, nothing in the forecast too extreme. And then midday tomorrow, it's going to get down to almost no wind at all. At least this is according to Windy, which I found to be pretty accurate. And then tomorrow night, the winds will shift and come out of the northeast. And they'll be increasing, and they'll stick out of the northeast through Wednesday. Now, the northeast is usually where we get that Fraser Valley cold rather than the big storm winds. So really, by the time we're into Wednesday or Thursday, the winds are coming from the wrong direction really to have any big waves that would impact Sandy Point much. But it's tomorrow mornings that's going to be interesting. So let's take a look then at how the wind impacts the waves. So I want to bring up a thing called wind fetch, and what this is, it's part of the basic physics around how waves work, and it's known as the fetch length, or simply fetch, and it's how far over water a given wind is being blown without obstructions. And what that means is how much distance is that wind actually building the waves, building the storm surge. And the longer the distance is, the bigger the waves are. So when Hawaii gets hit, for instance, with waves that have come from Alaska or have come all the way from Antarctica with really big storms, they can get some pretty massive waves because it's got such a distance that those waves travel and the wind keeps pushing them and building them. But let's take a look here at a map and see. Here's Sandy Point, and let's just do a couple measurements here. So for instance, we'll move this up here in the corner, and if we measure from the east tip of Sandy Point over across Lummi Bay to the northeast, and we're talking about 1.28 miles of shallow water, and it might not be any water if the tide's out, but 1.28 miles is the distance that the wind can get waves to build. So very rarely do we see big waves coming out of the northeast because it just doesn't have a big distance there. If we look like if they're coming straight out of the south, for instance from Point Migley towards Sandy Point, click here and see we've got 2.6 miles, 2.64 miles that the wind can build straight out of the south to hit the south cape there, the south tip of Sandy Point. But if you get lucky on the angle and it shoots up, or unlucky I guess, through between Lummi Island and Gooseberry there, yeah, it might have five miles that it's building. In other places we look from like the corner of Orcas, if it's headed towards Sandy Point, we're looking at about 7 miles. So those are significantly bigger than the just over 1 mile that it would build across Lummi Bay. But let me zoom this out and let's take a look at a couple other measurements here. So if the wind's coming straight out of the west and it's building from Susha Island or Peytos Island, the distance there it has to travel is about 10 miles. So that 10 miles is with the same wind is going to be able to build a bigger wave than if you just had 5 miles or 1 mile of wind. Now if it's coming a little bit out of the northwest off of like let's say Main Island up here or Salt Spring or those areas, and we do that measurement, we can see that's 22 miles. So you might be able to get, with the same wind at that angle versus straight out of the west, you might get twice the size of waves that you would get if it was coming straight out of the west. But where it gets really interesting is, let's zoom this out a little bit here. If we measure from Sandy Point and you get a wind out of the northwest that's coming from all the way up by Hornby Island or Lasqueti Island, somewhere north of Nanaimo, we have a fetch, or the distance that the wind is pushing the waves, of 95 miles. And that 95 miles, that's the angle the wind was blowing at the day a year ago in January when we had the big flooding off of West Beach. And it was a storm that was just pushing big waves all the way down that angle until it hit the West Beach. And you can see at 100 miles or 95 miles, it can build a lot bigger wave than if it's going 3 or 4 miles or even 10 miles. But when we look at the forecast, that Windy app here, and jump to the beginning, when we're looking at where it's going to be based off of Windy's predictions around tomorrow morning, jump ahead just a little bit here. We can see as we move to the night, it's coming out of the south. Not a big fetch on those winds on how it's going to build the waves. Then it shifts out of southwest. Still not a big distance or fetch on how it's going to build those waves. And then still same thing. So not going to say that there's not going to be significant waves. There probably will be, based off of the storm that's being predicted. But I don't see that that it has the ability to build as big a waves as we saw in January a year ago when we had all that West Beach flooding. So overall, really where I'm going with this is, we should, living at Sandy Point or being in the area, we should always be prepared for wild weather situations, because you know it's going to happen. And whatever anybody says, whatever I say, whatever any prediction is out there, yeah, it could come up significantly different than what's being predicted, and we've seen that happen a lot. I'm just trying to share, these are the things that I use when I'm looking at the weather to try and guess what's going on. Just a lot of different tools to figure out what could happen and what might happen at Sandy Point. All right, I'm Steve Stedman. Have a great day. Hopefully it doesn't get too windy.